Well, it's official. We're back again. Another beautiful day for a think tank with two of my favorite people in the world, Mr. Ian Gershman, Chief Operating Officer, and Mr. Jonathan DiCarlo, Chief Executive Officer. And I'm Christopher Bennett, Chief Marketing Officer, C4 Consulting. So once in a while, we jump on here and we start to have interesting conversations as it relates to behavioral health care. So what's up, gentlemen? How the heck are you?
Doing well, doing well.
Doing well and enjoying the day. It's nice to talk
Perfect.
about startups. Maybe we can solve some issues for some folks that tend to kind of get into that cycle and then get stuck.
Startups. God, we have been getting a lot of phone calls and a lot of people are moving forward with wanting to start something in the space. And so kind of two sides of that. One is really de novo startup and kind of new to the industry and passionate and have a great vision and want to do something in the space. And then the other are some folks really kind of coming from adjacent sides of the industry, from senior care and senior housing and some of these spaces, and wanting to come into behavioral health. So I think it's a pertinent conversation.
I'd add, like, there's a third category there, and that third category is people who are running systems, programs, but want to kind of start something new or add something on, which is, again, feels almost like a startup because it's an unrealized service at that point, and there's going to be a lot of operational stuff that's going to need to go into it, which could even go all the way out to licensure and new accreditation. So again, I think that's a third one that we're seeing as well.
All right.
And I think the dynamics, though, in some ways are exactly the same.
Well, where should we start this conversation? I tend to go from the position of a lot of people coming into the space kind of don't know what they don't know, which makes sense. And as you guys think about, new people coming into the space, what are some of the things that become like, look, this is like step 1, 2, and 3. You want to come in, you want to build something, you're passionate, you have a reason for being here, you have a vision. Here's what you need to do. Here's where we start. Just kind of curious.
I can jump right in with my first 3 things. The first one is mission makes margin. Right? You got to have a sufficient motivation to make change, right? So clarifying your why is critical. Like, why are you doing this? And if you want, margin to be healthy, then your mission needs to be really clear and deliverable. The second one is get the facts first, right? Oftentimes we field a lot of calls where someone told someone they could make a ton of money doing X, Y, or Z, and that's why they're calling. Sure. And someone told me I could get reimbursed this for this service in this market. But I called the insurance payer and they told me that the reimbursements are, Y, not X. And how do I do this? Right. So getting the facts first and really having all the facts about the approach, the business, the audience of service, who's going to receive care, how are you going to market it, all those things, getting that really detailed. And then the financial models follow after that.
Got it.
Because usually it's almost the opposite, that we get information presented to us as consultants where someone's built a financial model and they're trying to fill in everything after that. And they want the world to fit their model, as opposed to having a really clear mission and having all the facts about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, and then building their financial model and business plan from there.
Facts like payer rates, demand, competition.
Exactly.
Right? Like those are right. Okay.
Digital marketing costs, staffing costs, how available are staff in a particular area? What's the challenge in that area? Is that service really needed? Do you need one more Starbucks coffee shop on the corner next to the other 18 Starbucks that are already there?
Yeah, another residential detox in, blank city that already has, 3,900 detox beds, private pay. Yeah, exactly.
that are all at 50% or less occupancy, and people are fighting over the same service audience, struggling, increasing their digital spends, and then firing their relational marketers.
Yeah.
I mean,
And I know you have something.
Well, I think Jonathan was, channeling Peter Drucker when he said, mission has to drive margin. What we do need to look at the other side of that, which is that margin needs to drive mission. And I also think it's a function sometimes of who we are and how we meet those people in space, right? So there is the element that you have to have the vision and the mission, and then think about what it is you want to do and do that work, so that you then sort of sort the budget to manage that. The flip side of that I experience regularly is it's time to stop talking about the vision. It's time to stop talking about the thing that's lit you up, that's brought you to this space, that makes you want to open this magical, beautiful residential detox treatment program where people are going to actualize and be fantastic. And that's great, and that drives it. At some point, my experience is we have to pull people out of that space and say, okay, that's fabulous. Let's see how we're going to make that actually happen, step by step by step.
Yeah.
And I think that the jump that I wanted to make from here is to say that when people come, again, with this vision, and the vision could be, I want to do good and I want to make money. That's okay. That's a great vision. I also find and see that that has to be executed through a team approach. Even as an executive director who has vision and it's entrepreneurial and really can motivate people, I have to recognize that there are many things that I just can't do, or I don't see that way. And I might need somebody, even though I might be trying to save money in that startup, I need to bring somebody in who's going to be able to kind of wrap their head around that granular stuff, so that I, as the CEO, can keep visioning out. That's what I find frequently is where people get stuck in that early phase, even after we've done the mission and the vision, and we then start to do the feasibility, and then we start to look at the finance. It's then when we get to execution, we really need people who are very on the ground and perhaps a little less visionary and more integrative in terms of how they do that work. That was a lot. Sorry.
Well,
No, it's yes, it is a lot, right, to take in, but you're exactly right that all day, every day, we can live in the big idea and the 30,000-foot view, and we can work on our business plan and our vision and our values and our financial model, which, look, at the end of the day, for a startup, a financial model is a vision, right? Like it's not real. The business plan is not real. There's nothing that exists at that point, right? I mean, the real side is, as Jonathan described, obviously we can get payer data and we can understand our competition, and right there's some tangible elements to that. But at the end of the day, a lot of that kind of initial stuff is very vision based. So now it's like, well, great. Okay. Now we know that here's what the numbers say in our business plan, but now you're exactly right. Like, what do we actually start to do, and how do we start to actualize this? And I think a conversation at some point we need to have, whether it's today or another day, is you're exactly right, that without operational experts in behavioral health care, it's very challenging to be able to then actualize, right? What steps need to be taken when, and how often, and then I'll pass it off, how often someone calls and says, can you help me evaluate my EMR decision? And I say, you don't even have a business plan or like a policy and procedure manual. Yeah. But the EMR is really important. And yes, it is. But how do we actually operationalize how you use an electronic health system for documentation if we don't actually even know the program you're building, how it's going to function, and how it's actually going to work on a day-to-day basis? And so that pathway, as you're describing, what needs to be done when and how, requires definitely a certain level of expertise and experience to help folks get there. Jonathan,
I think
something.
Yeah, well, no, I think you're right on. Is that, once you have that model built and you have that business plan written, to Ian's point, that the integration of that and the implementation is then, it's twofold. It's realizing that a business plan is a roadmap, but also that the map is not the territory, right? That you're going to encounter things that are going to, require you to pivot, require you to, make different decisions that are different from the ideal, the vision, that there's the reality, and that those two come together. I don't know if anyone's ever truly trusted Google when you're on a bridge and it says to turn left and just keep turning left right off the bridge into the water. I live near the Arkansas River, and so every once in a while, Google Maps is not very trustworthy, and it wants me to turn in a place where I should definitely not turn. It wants me to go someplace that's a road that is a forest road, not a paved road, which I've had. Right? It just said, "Oh yeah, no, if you just go a little further over here through this ravine, which is barred by a giant steel pillar, and you can get to the road, and then you can get to your destination." It's like, well, there isn't pavement underneath me. Fortunately, I drive a 4x4 F-150, and I'm prepared for such occasions of, why am I driving through a field? Google is telling me. But the reality is that the map is not the territory.
There might be something very metaphoric in that. And that's kind of what, as you were talking, I was thinking it is also about being nimble in our, in and an ability to shift and to move. And it takes some nimble intellect as well to be able to hold my vision while I'm maybe having to shift a little bit about what the client population is, what the level of care is that looks like. And again, that's sort of that balance in that I have to be careful as if I'm starting up, that my vision doesn't drive through what's real time, what's factual, what's happening. I'll give you a good example. Working with an organization that the vision was really, let's get MAT in place. Let's create a different kind of opioid replacement model for people. And we're going to do that by being very low barrier in terms of prescribing. And yet we're on the flip side of it, that we're going to say, you need to be in some care. We're not just going to prescribe you medicine without some care wrapped around it. Right? So it was a great idea. It was a fabulous idea. What we discovered was there weren't a lot of opioid users that were looking for care in that area, right? So again, the organization had to sort of say, well, we really believe in this, and yet maybe this isn't our client population, and we need to shift a little bit, because we can still drive our mission through, which is meeting people where they're at, trying to create low barrier care as much as possible, trying to ensure the safety is in place. And yet they still had to shift because they realized it just wasn't going to be a massively viable population that was going to impact their bottom line. So I think that ability to be nimble is important. And if I could just say it, what can be really challenging from an operator's perspective, like the integrator operator perspective, is trying to rein in some of those visionaries and trying to pull them back in and say, like, I love your vision. That's great. Like, here's what we have to do to actualize it. And your vision over on this like little component, how can we move that over to this piece? Because we can't actually actualize that specific thing. And I think that can be really challenging, say, as an example, for a COO to move a CEO kind of out of that space and get them to shift over to something else. That can be a challenge in startup.
Well, for sure. And you talk about, now we're diving into a very specific dynamic, because, I think we collectively believe in this idea that a visionary functions extremely well with an integrator, and an integrator functions very well with a visionary. But at the same time, that is a dynamic and a bond that does have to be created and worked on, as you mentioned, so that the integrator can pull the visionary back, and also that the visionary can pull the integrator forward, right? And it's kind of this nice, beautiful dance. And so, maybe the point of that conversation really for folks is to explore, look, if you're coming into the space, is really, where does, what is your zone of genius, right? Because there are very few that are visionary integrators that hold both of those kind of qualities and characteristics. And so I think, another layer to this is ultimately, really doing a lot of, insightful work into who am I as this founder, and ensuring that the right people are on the bus, but they're also in the right seat on the bus. Because otherwise, it can get pretty messy. to Carlo. You got anything on that?
I think that dynamic's important. And again, I think in the real world application of building a behavioral health business, whether you're starting, from that de novo side, that startup side, or that, as Ian described, you're an existing provider and you're going to start a whole new service line. That example you gave was really great.
Yeah.
Trying something and having a vision and then realizing, even though we measured some of this, we're not seeing the demand in the market, so we need to pivot. I think realizing that, ultimately a business plan is a treatment plan, right? It's the same thing, it's the same analog. It's the same steps. If we find that the treatment plan isn't working for serving someone in care, we don't just keep using the same plan. Right.
Yeah.
We look at some very specific things and say, well, what worked, what didn't, and what can we try differently to have that effect that we want to have. We want to see a change in a symptom. We want to see a change in a condition. And so how do we do that? And so I think coming into that, again, I think that clear mission, is one part of it, and to extend the Drucker, spirit further into our conversation, it's that culture trumps strategy every time. Is that having that culture, that dynamic, and understanding who's in the right seats, especially in a startup. In a startup place, a lot of times, people will hire, say, a business development person because of their networks and expect them to produce a certain amount, and they even commit to producing a certain amount, and then that doesn't happen. And so what do? The owner just gets frustrated, or the business development person gets scared, and then they quit and go somewhere else. Or, rather than working together to say, well, why wasn't this working and what happened? And looking at the facts. Again, I think measuring the facts is a common theme in my conversations today, of really looking at what's real and what do we need to do to meet that reality and shape that reality, to change that reality. So I think those dynamics are really important, and people being secure but nimble, right? I think it is. I think that balance can be maintained, and there's organizational culture that fosters that, and I think that there's certainly clear mission and clear plans, but knowing that plans adapt, and that you have backup plans. And then when you run out of backup plans, then what do you do? When A, B, and C haven't worked, you keep going down the alphabet, ultimately. But at some point, it's to say, don't give up, but continue finding the solution and enlisting those who have the experience to do so, if they're not within your organization. And even stepping outside of that mentality, that because someone has a skill set, in operations, because someone has a skill set in business development, because someone has a skill set as a visionary, doesn't necessarily mean they have all the answers.
Yeah.
And just, it's easy to forget. It's easy to turn to a function rather than a person. And I think turning to the person always generates the opportunity for a new solution, and saying, well, what do we try next? And is not just a new idea, but what's an idea together that we can, put in place that really makes a difference? How can we collaborate differently?
I love that you bring up, both of you have used the term nimble, and I actually love that word. I've recently been using fluid, right? Like fluid and flexible. Nimble is, I feel like, better. The thing I'll say on that is, when we talk about, right, like coming into the space and doing diligence and understanding data and the numbers and the competition, and right, you can have all of that. You can combine that with a great vision, and let's call it an anecdotal. I see a need in a particular space, a particular market. I can service that need. I have the data that then supports that vision, right? But it may not be a month before you go, whoa, the data and my experience need to shift, as Ian described and as Jonathan described. And so that ability to be nimble is so critical, not only in that, but I think of, you might go pull, 20,000 claims out of a particular market for an intensive outpatient program. But if you don't open and get contracted for a year, those rates may be different at that point, right? And so then how do we shift gears again and say, okay, the data we had 12 months ago is not as accurate today as it was 12 months ago. So now what do we do here? And so that idea of agility, nimble agility, is so critical. I'm glad that you guys brought that to the table.
Yeah, I think, again, that's what I think makes an organization successful, is that it can it can pivot, it can be nimble, it can examine its own self. Because I was thinking about something you were saying, Chris, and then I was sort of reflecting back on my experience with this medication assisted. I also have confirmation bias, especially if I'm visionary and I'm coming into the space and I'm entrepreneurial. I have some confirmation bias about what I believe is right, what I believe is going to
Mm.
be an effective treatment model, or even like the model that I want to work in. And it's important, especially on that side, in terms of selecting partners. If I'm in that visionary space, it's really important to select partners who can speak directly to me, who can say things like, I know that's what you want to do, but the data doesn't support that you're going to be able to provide that service at any length. Or again, like just to be very granular, one of the things we see now is trying to work with people who are opioid dependent. And the fentanyl is so rife in their systems that our models of how we treat them and the things we require from them they're not that effective, because we can't get people into treatment. And yet, even for me, who is very pro Suboxone, buprenorphine treatment, have had to recognize that we got to do something different, because we can't get people in to even get them on that medicine. We have to be nimble and try and do something different. And I think it's really important. Again, it's about, having, if I'm in that role of entrepreneur visionary, it's really important that I have somebody sitting next to me who can put their hand on my arm and say, hang on a second, let's just talk about this, and let's just see what it really looks like in real time when those clients start walking in the door.
So we've covered a lot of this. Well, we would probably call almost like phase one, right? Let's get data. Let's have the data start to tell us a bit of a story. Let's combine the vision. Let's start to align with the right people. Let's start to model this thing out to make sure that this is sustainable and profitable. And I love that both of you came from different angles on that coin, which is, mission and margin, and margin and mission. So, okay. And then Ian started to go a little bit towards, now it's time to do, right? So great. We have all this now. We know where we want to go, but now we got to start doing. So as providers start to think about this, and again, there's not a lot of context here as to if we're talking about, mental health stabilization or intensive outpatient for substance use. But where does someone go next? Like, what do folks start to think about, at least?
So the thing I want to do is I want to just come back to, again, some of our experiences, which is that there's like a sequencing of events. And then people sometimes come having said things like, well, I've chosen my EMR. They don't have a location. They don't have a policy and procedure. And they're not entirely even clear about what they want to do, but they've got their EMR. Some people will come on and show up and say, I've got a building. Like, I've got this building. This is it. Like, this is what I want to do. Or I've got this house. Like, I want to turn it into a rehab. I've got this house. I think there are sort of parallel lines running alongside, like, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And where are we going to do it? And those things can kind of run along simultaneously. If I'm working as a consultant with somebody, I'm always going to be looking at, like, what is their strength? Somebody might come and say, my strength is real estate. I'm ready to go out and look at and establish a lease for a site. And so then my kind of, again, particularly for me, I'm moving in and out, just making sure that, again, so it's still back to saying, well, I see your vision. You love this beautiful office space that has gardens and fountains in it, and it's in La Jolla. That's fantastic, right? I love that. But is it really going to get you to where you want? Because you said to me you want to treat Medi-Cal patients. I don't think you're gonna face certain challenges. Not necessarily treating them, like, not necessarily because your treatment program is in La Jolla, but you need to think about transportation, because probably a lot of them aren't living in La Jolla, and you're going to be bringing them in. So that's kind of, again, it's that notion of, like, the sequence of events. I need a location. We've already established that I'm clear about what it is I want to do, my mission and my vision, right? The values and how I want to do it. But now we're down into, like, where am I going to do it? And what's it going to look like inside that? What are all the components that need to be in place, and the sequencing of those components? And again, it's always cadenced towards the person that's coming in. I might be somebody who's great at licensure. So that might be the first thing. Although, again, it was very interesting. We discovered this week, if I'm in the state of Maryland, I have to pursue accreditation first, not licensure. So again, it's that's the stuff where it's very knowledge based, and I have to have that roadmap set out really clear so that I kind of don't deviate and get somewhere and suddenly realize I didn't do this behind me and I have to go back now.
Yeah, I think about it as to the engagement experience, right? A lot of times when people bring that up, they're solely focused on the person receiving care. But I think the engagement experience is really everyone. It's internal to the organization, like we were describing. It's external with stakeholders such as accrediting bodies and regulatory agencies, right? I think about the next step. Someone's got a map and it's like, okay, well, you've gotten the requirements for the license, in your type of service and for that audience, and you start to do that. Someone's out looking at the real estate, making sure it's the right, coding and facility and the right environment of care, and that it's going to be able to be utilized at the right amount of space and the right services and the right experience, not just again for the person receiving care, but for the staff providing care. What does that workflow look like in that space? Right. So engaging with the payers and getting applications for various, contracts going for services. I think it's that engagement experience all the way through. And looking and answering your question, Christopher, about like what's next after I've got the map and I've got some clarity and I'm hitting the ground. It's getting, the accreditation and the licensure going. And in that, the requirement of the policies and procedures, and not just being perfunctory about that, being really thoughtful of how are these things going to be delivered? Because that's what a good policy and procedure manual should do. Is it's a living document that is applied, that when someone has a question about how to do something, they can go to it and get the information for the right direction of how do I respond to this thing that's in front of me that's happening, right? Whether it's care, whether it's organizationally, whether it's how do we choose, who makes a decision on an EMR when the one that was, bought, long before we had the policy and procedure doesn't fit our needs, and we have to go tell the boss, the CEO, the supervisor, the owner, they bought the wrong thing. It can't do what we need it to do. We just found out that we have to now duplicate this service over here because that's what the state requirement is, and that wasn't necessarily considered in the beginning. Right? So really having those engagement experiences attuned is the healthiest practice forward. And again, it's having all that information together, collated, and everyone, on the dance floor dancing to the same rhythm, right? Deciding what the cadence of something needs to be at the particular time. Not trying to rush a process and say, oh, we need to do this. I have anxiety about this particular area. It's like, well, but if we take care of the policies and procedures, a lot will flow from that because it'll be the guiding document from where we go, and it'll inform things as we move forward, right? But not being so rigid to those that every single action and step is documented where there's no room to pivot, right? Being able to have something that flows, right? Again, that engagement experience internally to an organization of when I need to get my needs met, how do I do it? And is there an order of operations that I can follow to create a solution when one doesn't exist? Right. When there's a new challenge that I'm trying to face. Right. So being able to then look at those things simultaneously. And I think you'll like what I'm about to say, Christopher, is that it's never too early to market once you have a vision, but you can spend too much time marketing at the wrong part of the process if you don't have clarity of what's going to be delivered and where it's going to be delivered. But you can, be applying for your license and start working on your marketing. I can't tell you how many times we get into a cadence with someone where we have marketing very early in the process and starting to make decisions, and somebody thinks, oh, just having a frame of a website is enough. It's like, well, that's not really enough, right? How are you teaching the people who you're hiring in the business, building this business, to be the promoters of the business, right? And at the same time, that cadence of all that information and that experience being shared. So I tie it back to it's an engagement experience.
Sure. I mean, and what comes to mind as you guys are talking is how often we've helped people put together like a Gantt chart kind of right after a business plan and a model are done that then lays out the next 6 to 18 months, right? And again, it's not something that's in stone. It's very much a nimble document in a sense, but literally this is what we need to do this week next week, next month. Here's when we begin this part of the process. And you talk about marketing, right? I mean, I think about, 6, 9, 12 months before opening. A lot of times you're not going to providers to say, yeah, we're going to have an outpatient clinic in a year, but you might be going out to work with the first responders and the local municipality and the city council, and right, like some of the key kind of community-based relationships that are going to be critical when things like NIMBY come up. So folks that aren't aware, like not in my backyard, people don't love treatment centers in their backyard. So like, who do we need to be advocating for us if and when that time arises, right? And so it may not be that we look at these traditionally as, oh, we're going to go get referrals from the local university, the local high school system, the local first responder department. But at the end of the day, these are the people that will show up and raise their hand and say, look, we've built a wonderful relationship with Ian and Jonathan, and we trust them. And we know that they're coming in and doing good work. And so being able to even expand upon what we look at as probably more traditional marketing or sales in the space to say, what type of relationships can we begin to work on as soon as possible that are just going to be of, significant assistance and support to this business long term.
Yeah. I was thinking though, as well, in that sort of sense of like how the startup kind of begins to unfold and evolve. It's also very, I think as people starting up, we have to be very honest, like about what our capacity is, what our strengths are, where we are. And then also, again, like from a fiscal perspective, what we can afford. So if I was starting up and I was very sort of business oriented, very entrepreneurial, and I needed somebody very granular, I have a couple options here. If I'm applying for licensing, I need a clinical director identified. Now, does it make more sense for me to just say, hey, Jonathan, I need to use your name as the clinical director here. I'm going to hire you. It's probably 3 to 4 months out, but I want to use your name, and we'll make an arrangement on that. Or it might make more sense for me to say, Jonathan, I need a clinical director. I actually want to hire you full time now because I know your strength is policy and procedure. And so I know you can organize that and make that work. It's cheaper for me to do that. And it makes more sense than it would be to hire a consultant to create a policy deck and bring that in. So I think those considerations are about really, and maybe this is difficult for entrepreneurs to say, like, I'm really good at this, but I'm not good at this. And I really need help with this. In fact, I know so little about this. I'm going to hire this guy over here and trust him to do what he's supposed to do. I'm going to stop asking questions about insurance or something like that. I'm going to stop asking questions, except that I do want to be educated. I'm also going to make sure that I've got the expert in place doing what they're supposed to be doing.
That, I think, is a lot of entrepreneurs' journey, right? Yeah. Is having the insight into their skills and what they're not so skilled at. Yep.
And again, like, that's the nimble piece. That's the part of saying, oh, actually, I have this person, I've identified them as a clinical director, but they're not really like, this isn't their wheelhouse, right? This component of how they drive care forward and how they lead care in a system, it's not really in their wheelhouse. So I need to find somebody who can, or a system, or a piece of software, or a consultant who can help them with this piece here and get them there. I think that's the real challenge in startups, is that the vision doesn't get in the way of like the steps that need to happen to kind of take them to the vision. Said by an operator.
And appreciated by a visionary. Yes. And it's true, right? So, we talk about kind of this, just kind of pulling this almost timeline together, right? Data, story, vision, mission, all this. Now it's like, okay, roadmap, starting to align with the right people, right? Especially if I don't know what I don't know, right? So coming into the space and saying, look, I've got the intangibles, but at the end of the day, I may not really understand healthcare compliance or, licensing, accreditation, policy and procedure. How does this thing function? Is then, as to your point, how do I begin to align with the right people? And not just align with the right people, Jonathan, can I use your license, but will you actually take this? right? And am I going to be able to hand this to you, take this, run with it, and I'm going to trust that you're going to be able to do that. So sounds like as a part of this kind of next phase of road mapping and how do we start to handle certain things and when is also we start to align with the right people, which is really critical. Jonathan, you've been quiet. Anything to add to that?
Well, I think that insecurity drives people to want to exert more control. And to both of your eloquent points, when someone is trying to do too much that's out of their skills, domain, or knowledge, right? Really trusting someone else to be able to do it becomes really challenging. And so the answer to resolving anxiety is not more control, right? Especially in a startup process, especially when you're facing these challenges of, being secure but nimble, and learning and building trust within your team and resources becomes critical, right? Making some of those decisions early on and learning to trust them is not letting go of your vision, but putting it on the wall in the space and then turning to it, right? A treatment plan isn't a checklist. We've done this activity, check, right? It's not a linear process as we're talking about it, right? So really being able to look at a couple of things I think is really important within that. And that it is about being able to understand the experience, right? One of the things, especially for newer owner operators or going into a new service line for existing providers, is if I don't know what the experience of that service is like, I'm going to have a hard time managing anybody involved in it. Right? I really, challenge people to do that. I recently was in conversation with someone who is a chief technology officer at a company. And I had said, if you really want to understand what the service experience is like, you have to realize that as a behavioral healthcare provider. And he said, well, hang on, I'm not a provider. I'm a chief technology officer at a company that provides a service within behavioral health. I said, well, therefore you're connected to providers and the service you produce is used by providers to provide care. Therefore, you're part of a provider network. Therefore, I would classify you as a provider. It's really going to be most helpful for you to understand these challenges that you're experiencing in serving the providers themselves from the provider's perspective. And so I asked the question again, who's your therapist? If you're having trouble understanding a therapist, who's your therapist? What's your experience? Being a consumer of that experience is really helpful because it can help unlock those resources in that relationship, right? Whether it's provider to provider, coworker to coworker, right? I circle back to that. It's people serving people and people helping people at every stage of the game. No matter what, if you're talking about a software company, if you're talking about, your accountant, if you're talking about a regulatory agency, if you're talking about payers, you're interacting with people. It's not just product, market fit. It's the relationship of the people who are connecting those products and markets together that comes down to it. So oftentimes one of the great challenges, and we see it a lot, is communication, right? Being really critical, and that people communicate in different ways, right? So again, part of that engagement experience, part of that dynamic that we're talking about is having really consistent communication and a cadence where everybody gets the information, especially in a startup where there's all these moving pieces at different paces and in different rhythms, all hanging together under a rhythmed cadence. In the big picture, sometimes we get caught up with our particular part of the dance and forget that there's 4 other steps happening at the same time, not at the same time as your particular set of moves. That I think comes down to learning to trust and trusting differently and building trust differently.
Lot said there. A couple of things that just kind of came to the head is that, again, I think the way you described that clinical, like as a metaphor for the structuring and moving forward as a business, is that if I'm a clinician and I'm just doing my treatment plan without your collaboration, then I'm not particularly nimble. I'm not really responsive to anything that's going on. I'm just kind of following forward with the pathway. And again, if I'm thinking that way, it's unlikely that I'm going to even understand when there's a negative outcome or a poor outcome that I wanted to have happen for my client. I'll generally slip into that space. That clinician would slip into that space saying, oh, it's the client's fault. They didn't engage. It wasn't me, it was the client. I did this program. This program is great. And so again, I think it's similar to that experience, is that as a visionary CEO, I have to be willing to have somebody on the ground say, I hear your vision and I see it and I know what you want. I don't think it's going to work right here in the way that you expect it to work. And so then we've taken ourselves back to that kind of that nimble question of being willing to say, well, here's my vision. It may not work in this way. I can still make it work because this is what I want to do. This is how I want to create. I was also stuck on the notion that a chief technical officer wasn't concerned with the end user's experience. So again, for me, like I would have to step all the way back and start to think, wow, like how can you not know that? Maybe I've been working with them for a while. So I think, oh, maybe I've missed something here. How have I not communicated that, like that end user experience? They don't understand that, or it's not even an important thing. And the last thing I want to say is, again, something that you said, Jonathan, is this notion is that we're all driving forward to an end goal that's really important, that we're all aligned with. So it's really important for me to understand that if I'm a clinical director and I'm designing clinical services and structures, that's super important. What's also just as important is housekeeping and maintenance, and that all of us contribute to this like single outcome, that my trauma work with the client is not any more important than ensuring that the equipment for housekeeping is like up to date, taken care of, there when they need it, repaired on time. And so then again, then it's really obvious, right, that the knock-on effect of that is a beautiful facility where this person who has trauma, who meets with me, feels safer and more contained and more comfortable in that space. I think that's a really key piece that I see a lot, which is that there's, it's almost like there's a sexiness applied to some things and there's like a mundacity applied to other things. And that creates a fraction within an organization.
Absolutely.
I think we used to say like, I don't care where the idea comes from. It can come from the guy who's like sweeping up the front steps prior to family group coming in that night. Like, it doesn't matter. Wherever the best idea comes from, that's the one we want to engage with.
For sure. And we only have another minute or so. And one of the things, and this is an entire conversation in its, excuse me, I can't even speak today, is the clinician that decides to start a business. Right? Can be a bit of a different dynamic, right? So we've talked about the visionary experience and kind of the entrepreneurial visionary side, but then also there's the clinician who's very visionary in their own unique way. But a lot of times it's so driven down to this is the end user experience, right? And this is like, this thing is where we're going to get to, and then being able to step into, well, we have to get housekeeping and we have to get all of these other things, as well as we've got to make money at this. And so it's just another unique perspective from that founder standpoint of, we'll also see the visionary clinician have their own unique journey as they come into, wanting to open a facility too.
Right. So that one's like, that's an easy one for me, right? So that I'm a therapist. I have a solid, group of people that I see and they do really well. And I think, okay, well, I see like 25 clients a week. What if I could see 100 clients a week, right? They would be fantastic. This would just be wonderful. And they don't think again about like, what's the knock-on effect of all the kind of intricacies of operation that have to take place to actually see 100 people with 5 therapists, as opposed to me and my beautiful little, my little office with the Zen fountain and all of that. They don't think about what happens when I try and scale that up to a much larger setting with people doing the treatment, but it's not me doing the treatment. So I do think that is an interesting dynamic. Yes.
Yeah. So Jonathan, anything to tie us up as we close out this think tank startup call?
I think just a last note on that last one, and it perhaps will be the starting point for our next adventure together, will be, I think for the clinician becoming, the business owner and scaling, it's about understanding how mathematics actually works. And I'll just put that little pin there. We can start there in the future about really understanding math and how math scales. But I think it does come down to being able to know and master consistency is everything. And everything we've talked about, the more consistent we are, the greater likelihood our solutions will be received by others.
Absolutely. Ian, any final thoughts on this startup conversation?
No, I think really from the relational perspective, it's about knowing myself, knowing who I am, knowing where my strengths lie, being humble enough to say I don't know that, and to be able to say like I need somebody to do that piece, and to recognize that collaboration is key. I don't have all the answers. Collaboration is absolute key, and that. And again, to be aware of myself when I hit the roadblocks and I'm not able to move forward, what's externally the cause of that, but also internally what's going on for me that's causing me a difficulty in the road, and it's got me stuck. I think that's that's the most important thing in everything we do, is to be self-reflective.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. I hope anyone that watches has enjoyed this conversation as much as I have.
Absolutely.
It's always beautiful to come together and share insights, and especially from the perspective of that we have three very unique perspectives and three unique skill sets and kind of zones that we operate really well in. So I think these conversations are really thought-provoking, and always just really enjoy having to challenge my own confirmation bias and own thoughts around what's so critical to the idea of starting a behavioral health organization. So thank you for joining us. And Ian, Jonathan, always a pleasure. Much love.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And we'll see you next time.